Welcome back. My name is Lisa Hayward and I'm from the DOE, from the Office of Social and Emotional Wellness. I think you all know us. I'm joined again by my dear colleagues, Catherine Leswing and Molly White. And today we are already running through our summer, and we're at the 5th part of our summer series on developing a Tier 1 system and practices. Our focus today is collecting and using data to track student outcomes. So if you like data like we do, you'll find this is a really interesting session. Just a recap of where we are. We're on part 5. We've got 6, 7, and 8 ahead. So take a look to see what's coming up in the next few weeks. But today our focus is on data collection and use to track student outcomes. From a preventative view, which is where we always start with these sessions, I pose the question, why do we collect and use data to track student outcomes? And there are 4 primary reasons for this. I'm sure you're familiar with them. But if not, it allows us to give school communities an objective understanding of how systems and practices are working for students. And with that, it informs our database decision-making. It helps us identify individual students who may need more support, who, for example, might need Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions later on down the road. And it helps us identify system issues that need to be resolved. So we might want to know, are the systems working for all locations and all subgroups? So those are our preventative reasons for collecting and using data to track student outcomes. And with no further ado, I'm going to pass you off to our expert, Catherine Leswing. Catherine.
Thank you, Lisa. So we're going to start today by talking a little bit about how to develop an evaluation plan for your Tier 1 strategies. And like Lisa mentioned, our Tier 1 strategies are all prevention strategies. They're universal. They're things that all students in the school setting are getting and have access to. And this grid right here that you're seeing is an example of an evaluation plan that you could fill out with your Tier 1 team to track the programs that you're doing at the Tier 1 level. So on the left-hand side, you could jot down the name of your Tier 1 prevention strategies. That could include your school-wide universal positive behavior expectations, your SEL curriculum, your acknowledgement system for students, anything that you're doing across the board for all students to improve their social and emotional and behavioral wellness. In that second column, you'll include the intended outcomes. And again, this helps to align and see if you have different intended outcomes for each program. Sometimes this brings to the light that, in fact, you're duplicating some efforts that are meant to achieve the same goal, or it might highlight some gaps. In the third column, you'll write your supporting outputs. So what is it exactly that needs to be done to achieve the intended outcomes? What are those real action items that are the outputs for the program? And then you'll list the indicators. The indicators are the specific data points that you will look to measure over time. So with a baseline measurement and then following down the road with regular checks to see if that baseline has moved. Collection frequency is how often you will collect those data points. And then last but not least, collection method is the tool that you will use to collect those data points. So it sounds a little complex, but hopefully we'll break it down a little bit more for you here. We did want to speak to the 2 types of indicators that you should list on your evaluation plan. And the first one is outcome indicators. So outcome indicators are those data points that tell us how students are doing and responding to a certain program. And our recommendation, and the recommendation of researchers, is to always choose indicators that are the closest to the signal or to the program that you're offering. So here in the example, you can see that a universal social emotional learning curriculum is the program being used for the strategy. And the indicator that's closest to this strategy would be really those observable social emotional competencies that students demonstrate. And that's known as a proximal indicator, those ones that are very close. As we move out, office discipline referrals are seen as a proxy for student wellness and could be used. Getting a little further out, overall student climate might give you an indication of how students are doing socially and emotionally. And then last, even further out is mental health outcomes. So again, that's a little bit more of a distal indicator. It might not be telling you how are all students doing in responding to the social emotional learning curriculum. So the key takeaway here is to focus on those proximal indicators, those ones very close to the intended outcome of your program. And the second type of indicator that you really want to include for every program that you're doing is a fidelity indicator. So how are you measuring how well a program is being implemented the way it was intended to be implemented? So if we look at this chart here that has 4 quadrants, we can see from left to right, it's measuring how much fidelity is being achieved. So on the left, it's low fidelity, to the right, it increases to high fidelity. And then vertically, we see what outcomes are being achieved. So on the bottom, it's unfavorable outcomes, and moving upward, you have more favorable outcomes. So how are outcome indicators and fidelity indicators linked? If we're not measuring fidelity, how well a program is being implemented as intended, we really don't have any idea whether or not the outcomes we're achieving are related to the actual program that's being implemented. So this is why fidelity is very important to measure. So just taking a couple of examples from this chart, if we look at, let's see, the number 4, where you're having relatively high fidelity of the program, but unfavorable outcomes, that right there tells you that the program is being implemented as intended, but it's not having the outcomes that were hoped for. So what needs to be tweaked? Is it something with the program? If it's an evidence-based practice, that's probably the case because it's something that's been tested and is tried. And then another example here would be, let's look up 1. So number 2, so high fidelity is achieved and you have favorable outcomes. And then wow, the program is working as intended and we're achieving the outcomes. So the outcomes and fidelity are very linked and really important to measure together. Here you can see the table that we initially displayed filled in for you with an example. The example here is using the Choose Love curriculum in 5th grade. We can see in that second column, the intended outcomes are that students demonstrate courage, gratitude, forgiveness, and compassion. Those are the pillars of the Choose Love curriculum. The supporting outputs indicate the things that will be done to make sure that the program's implemented. The indicators measure both fidelity and outcomes, as you will see there. The collection frequency is listed, and then the collection method is listed. And with many evidence-based practices or promising practices, there are a lot of times tools readily available, often for free, especially if the curriculum's been purchased, so not really free then, but already made tools that will help you measure outcomes and fidelity. So we are always happy to help you navigate that. And if no tool exists, we're happy to help you make one. All right, so really quickly, just kind of reviewing the types of indicators that you can and should include on your evaluation plan. Fidelity data, we talked about a little bit at length there about assessing whether the practice or framework is being implemented as intended, and making sure you're also tracking the student outcome data. So how are students responding to those practices? You could also include climate and culture data, which assesses the perception of the school environment. And then if your school collects screening data, either a set of criteria or an actual tool that measures observable behaviors to identify students who may need more supports, you could include that as well as a type of indicator. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Molly, who's going to talk a little bit more about collection methods.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So as she displayed on the chart earlier, when you're working through your plan, you want to be pretty clear about how you're collecting this data. And also, like we talked about earlier, fidelity is pretty important. Collecting implementation fidelity helps you understand the full picture of student outcomes. Oftentimes, this is a part of your curriculum that you've purchased. However, you can create a pretty simple fidelity tool by looking at the critical components that are there. What are the essential ingredients for having this implemented properly? And then capturing what does the gold standard look like? So what would it look like when this component is implemented to fidelity? And just kind of rating those on a scale 0 to 100%, maybe breaking it down by quarters, 25, 50%, you're halfway there, and so on, would be an easy way to kind of create your own fidelity tool that doesn't exist. Student outcome data can be collected a multitude of different ways, looking at office discipline referrals, attendance, nurse visits, academics are all factors that play into the global student's wellness. Climate and culture data is often collected through surveys, not just to your staff members, but how does family perceive the climate and culture of the school that their students attend? With climate and culture data, it's important to collect this, and with all data sources, collect it kind of every year so you can gauge growth, but collect from as large of a population as possible. So sending out multiple reminders to families and staff to fill out those surveys when you do have them. And then screening data. So this can be used, oftentimes we see teachers filling out screeners on behalf of the students that they serve, just taking down observable behaviors that they see. So they're not making any judgments or guessing how this is impacting the student, just writing down facts about what they've observed the student to be displaying, whether it's, around their behavior and their ability to regulate, or attendance, and those types of things as well are included. And on the next slide, we have some considerations for success. So we know when we're looking to collect data, there's a lot of different components that go into it. Even just now, how you're collecting the data, it can be varied. So when you have this much data, we encourage you to schedule regular times to review it, and pretty frequently as well. When we're saying regular, you want to be checking in on the data with some sort of frequency, however you're collecting it, to make sure that what you're implementing is having the intended outcomes. And again, we've kind of talked about it a few times now, but monitoring fidelity is a crucial component of measuring success. So like the graph with the 4 quadrants had displayed, if you're not measuring fidelity and you're having low outcomes for your students, it's hard to know which is the cause. Is it that the program isn't in support of it, or that maybe the implementation of the program isn't exactly how it was intended? We also encourage you to consider the reach of your strategies being used. So if the breadth, depth, scope, or dose are not the appropriate amount, you may or may not see the intended outcomes. So if the program is meant to be delivered, daily and integrated into the regular academic curriculum, but the dose is actually occurring only weekly with your student support services team, since that dose isn't exactly aligned with the implementation recommendations, it may not be aligned with the outcomes that you're expecting. So consider those categories when you're looking to improve upon what you've already implemented. And then, of course, with collecting data, we encourage you to share the data, not just internally with your staff, but aggregate data can be shared out with the community and families. This can be used to garner buy-in for people to jump on board and be excited about the curriculum, maybe create some homeschool connections, but also can be used for decision-making about whether or not this is something we want to sustain and fund long-term. So with that, we encourage you to reach out, like Catherine alluded to earlier. We're here and happy to help you either explore Fidelity tools or create your own with templates. And if you see that your area is not represented, still please reach out to Catherine or I, and we're happy to point you in the right direction. And looking forward, we hope that you've seen the videos to date. And in the future, we will be releasing our next video on SEL curriculum, and be sure to stay tuned for the rest of them.